For a long time, the immense Amazon rainforest has been considered the green lungs of the planet and a formidable reservoir of biodiversity. Its hundreds of billions of trees absorb carbon and release oxygen, a vital contribution to making our planet breathable and limiting its warming. Its global climate role is not in doubt, but rampant deforestation threatens it. It has been watched, measured, scrutinized by researchers around the world for decades. 15 years ago, it was discovered that it was overflowing with powerful streams of moist air. These were the extraordinary flying rivers. For 40 years, Antonio Nobre has sought to decipher the functioning of the Amazonian climate.
To me, this tree is like a green geyser. It pumps 1,000 liters in a day from the ground all the way to the atmosphere. Those are real climate makers.
Antonio Nobre's research on these flying rivers and their role in the great climate machine has stumbled upon some important scientific puzzles.
You have a movement of winds around the planet, and there is an exception. And that happens to be right in the Amazon.
He then undertook a major survey from South America to the Siberian forests to unravel the secret of the true role of forests and to reveal their unprecedented contribution to the regulation of our planet's climate. Thanks to the discovery of the flying rivers, a new forest reality has emerged. The term flying river sounds strange to our ears. One immediately sees a huge displacement of water in the air, just as it exists on Earth. But while terrestrial rivers are made of liquid water, in the sky, they're made of water vapor. The first person to use the term flying rivers was a climatologist, José Marengo, who received a Nobel Prize for his 2 decades of work at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He has also contributed to numerous studies on the climate of the South American continent.
Usually, working with meteorology, we realize that there are regions in the planet when you have the stronger winds, you see. And then, when I was working and studying in the US, we start finding this pattern, and then we're starting to realize that there were some regions that behaves like a narrow channels of water, which actually are extremely important on the monsoon rainfall, either in India or here in South America. And then came this paper by Professor Xuan Newell from MIT. In 1998, they presented this in a conference.
By examining satellite images dedicated to the study of water vapor, 2 American scientists noticed filaments several thousand kilometers long. These bands, visible for several days in a row, were made up of water vapor. They gave them the name tropospheric rivers.
They have been there since we have observations. They are not new. They are there. They are part of the circulation.
At the dawn of the 2000s, the concept of flying rivers was born. One of these rivers often flew over the South American continent. One of the first people to take an interest in flying rivers in Brazil was a staunch environmentalist who, thanks to his skills as an airplane pilot, was familiar with the Amazonian skies. Gerard Moss, Brazilian by adoption and an adventurer, often flew into the tormented skies of the Amazon on behalf of the Brazilian Water Agency.
Flying over the Amazon is not that easy. You have this dense forest, very few airfields, and a lot of low cloud and rain.
I
began to fly regularly in Amazonia for the Waters of Brazil project, for which we used the seaplane to collect samples of water. from lakes, dams, and rivers. Over a period of 2 years, we managed to collect 1,600 samples, which we used to determine the quality of surface water. Already at that time, I noticed clouds above the trees. I wanted to find out where this moisture came from. From the forest? The trees? That's when I met Professor Antonio Nobre, who explained to me about these types of airborne rivers.
The meeting with Professor Antonio Nobre in 2006 would open up new perspectives for Gérard Moss. Antonio Nobre introduced him to the notion of flying rivers and to the work of Professor Salati, who used a new method to discover the origin of water vapor flows.
Salati was the first person in 1977 to use isotopes to identify an air mass close to Rio de Janeiro as one that had emanated from the Amazon. He found that the presence of oxygen isotopes 18 and 16 indicated whether the vapor was merely evaporated water or water that had emanated from trees. His work was extremely brilliant.
Depending on whether the water comes from the ocean or from trees, its vapor is slightly different. A water molecule is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. If the water vapor results from the transpiration of the trees, the oxygen atom will contain O16 isotopes, or O18 isotopes if it is water evaporated from the oceans.
As a born traveler, I wondered how I might navigate these rivers. This time I couldn't use a boat, it would have to be an aircraft.
Gérard Moss resumed his flights and began collecting samples again, but this time of water vapor. These vapor samples were then analyzed to find out if the water molecules were of oceanic or forest origin. By combining this information with meteorological data from satellites, Gérard Moss succeeded in exploring and mapping the flying rivers.
We take off, starting with Belém. Then, as expected, it heads towards Acre, turning south, southeast. We land at Mato Grosso. The air mass has continued on its way and passed over Sao Paulo.
But before reaching the south of the continent, the flying rivers meet the Andes Cordillera in the west of the South American continent. This high barrier of 6,000 meters interferes with the movement of flying rivers, as demonstrated by a scientific study called SALGEX, led by José Marengo.
SALGEX was a field experiment that we decided to develop together with the United States, Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, and Argentina, try to find out more information about the structure and the functioning of the low-level jet from South America, because we didn't know that much. We basically have data from stations around to see the rainfall, for instance, and we have pilot balloons, which are these huge balloons where we can follow the direction of the winds, and we have the radiosondes.
Wind and humidity measurements at the foot of the Andes clearly established this dynamic of moisture-laden air mass.
Basically, the winds that come in from the Atlantic flow the Amazon, encounter the Andes force them to shift and to accelerate. And that's when it looks like at the core of a river. That's the name, atmospheric rivers, or low-level jet, the jet because of the speed.
SALGEX demonstrated the existence of an air current charged with moisture, mainly fed by the trade winds coming from the Atlantic, where it's joined in the summer by another subtropical current. This current crosses the Amazon in the direction of the Andes, where it must branch out towards the south of the continent. It's an authentic flying river. If there's any scientist who is well aware of how important these flying rivers are, it is Earth science specialist Antonio Nobre. For this researcher at the Brazilian National Space Research Institute, these flying rivers are even at the origin of what he calls the lucky quadrangle. But why does he use such a term?
In studying the mighty rainforest in the Amazon, and the relation with climate, I came across this curious region in South America. I named it in 2006, the lucky quadrangle that goes from Cuiabá in the north, Buenos Aires in the south, São Paulo in the east, and the Andes in the west. In the center of this area, you will find one of the most beautiful waterfalls in the world, which is basically saying this area is wet, although it shouldn't be wet.
In this lucky quadrangle are the wonderful Iguazu Falls, a natural wonder inscribed as a World Heritage Site. Without the moisture of the flying rivers that precipitates as rain upstream of this site, these waterfalls wouldn't vaporize the water of the Iguazu River so dramatically. This lucky quadrangle has the highest population density in South America. Today, it is the beating heart of the continent, where 70% of South America's wealth is produced.
So why is the Lucky Triangle so prosperous and so wet? If you look in the same latitude where the Lucky Triangle happens, you have the Namibia and Kalahari Desert in Africa, and in Australia you have the outback. On the other side of the Andes, you have the Atacama Desert, one of the driest deserts in the world. There you have the Lucky Quadrangle in an area where it should not be. It should be a desert there. Why is that it's not a desert?
On the same latitude, to the west of the Andes, lies the hyper-arid desert of Atacama, where sometimes it doesn't rain for decades. While to the east of this rocky barrier are the most prosperous regions of South America. And this is no coincidence. It depends on certain properties of global atmospheric circulation, and in particular, the Hadley cell.
One must ask why you have the deserts organized around the globe in latitude 30 north, 30 south. It's not by chance. What happens? This solar radiation arriving at the equator will warm the land and warm the air. The air rises because it's lighter, and then it moves towards the higher latitudes. As it does it, it loses moisture, and that's where you have rainfall. And thereafter, the air is dry, and then it goes to the latitude 30 north and 30 south. And there is where dry, hot air comes down, stealing moisture from the surface and producing deserts there. This is called the Hadley cell, and explains why the deserts are where they are, really, except for the Lucky Quadrangle. Why?
To understand how flying rivers work, you have to venture into the heart of the tropical forest. Rainfall is here. Water is everywhere, visible and invisible. The incredible hydrological basin of the Amazon, with its numerous tributaries, attests to this dynamism. But what role does the Amazon rainforest play in this prodigious hydrological cycle? How do these countless trees contribute to the flying rivers? Our investigation continues at a scientific base located in a protected area of the Amazon rainforest, the Tapajos National Forest, under the joint responsibility of the American University of Arizona and the Brazilian Organization for Research in the Amazon, INPA. Here, a battery of instruments is deployed to measure the breathing of the forest. One focus of the research here is photosynthesis, the fundamental process by which trees feed by absorbing CO2 and releasing oxygen. Photosynthesis is a valuable clue to assessing the health of the forest. A young Brazilian researcher, Leonardo Zicardi, is a regular visitor to this scientific base. His work seeks to evaluate the true photosynthetic activity of the forest.
Chico, can you hold a ribbon for me?
According to him, the photosynthesis data obtained by satellites is imprecise, because it only takes into account the foliage of the canopy, the top layer of the forest.
As soon as I get it in my hand, the sun goes away. It's as if it's doing it on purpose. The Amazon is always unpredictable. You need to be patient.
For this, he measures, from the bottom to the top of the forest, the fluorescence of the leaves, an index that indicates their photosynthetic activity.
Modern technology now makes it possible to monitor large areas of forest by satellite. The problem is that satellite measurements are not necessarily precise, because they cannot detect what's going on here in the middle of the forest.
Leonardo's research will make it possible to establish the photosynthetic activity of the forest more precisely, critical input with regard to the climate emergency. It's also a key concern for Antonio Nobre, who relies on Leonardo Ziccardi to guide him in this unfamiliar forest.
So, Leonardo, what's this tree?
This is a piquia, one of the species that dominates the upper canopy. It's one of the most abundant trees in these parts. Something else I find fascinating is the root system in the soil.
But this root isn't the piquia's root. Where did these two come from?
This root
Is from the other one over there.
from that tawari over there. The incredible thing is that the root of the tawari is supporting the structure of this piquia.
Look, another one. It's like a network of steel cables holding them up at the upper root.
Yes,
A mooring system so the piquia doesn't fall. It's just incredible.
Roots have an important role, which consists in giving a physical support to the tree. This is why they grow outwards in all directions from the trunk.
How deep is the water table here?
very deep. You can go down 60 or 70 meters before reaching water.
So the function of the taproot growing below this big tree is to bring up water from the water table. So we may well have 70-meter roots here.
This piquia has developed a root called a taproot, much longer than its aerial part, so it can reach the water table. But to nourish itself, its root system has also developed a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi.
Research has been carried out. For example, a colleague of mine from the Czech Republic, Jan Čermák, studied the connection between these roots and fungi, a connection called mycorrhizae. He set out to calculate the quantity within a square meter of forest, which can contain up to 5,000 kilometers of fungi. These fungi are very effective at extracting water and nutrients.
This partnership enables the roots to draw water molecules and minerals. These inputs of water and mineral salts will form sap, which is crucial for the life of the tree.
This flow enters the tree through the xylem and rises. That way, the crown of the tree can be kept well supplied and well provided with water.
To reach the crown of the tree, several tens of meters high, the sap must complete a long journey.
Like any living organism, trees need to find nutrients. This is made possible by the deep roots absorbing water and mineral salts, which are then carried upwards through the xylem. So if we were to perform a cross-section of the structure of this tree, We would see water and sugars being carried from the roots to the leaves through the xylem.
Behind the bark is a tissue called xylem, an ultra-efficient tube system where sap circulates to make its ascent. Water can therefore defy gravity and reach the top of the tree.
Trees produce so many leaves because a single leaf, like this one, has a limited capacity to absorb light. So generating more leaves means they can absorb more light and exchange more carbon dioxide with the atmosphere. The process is the miracle of photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis is the process that uses the energy of the sun to make sugars from the carbon dioxide taken in from the air and from the water drawn up by the roots. This biochemical reaction releases oxygen.
What is interesting is that only a small amount of water absorbed by the tree is used to nourish the tree itself. Most of it is used to dissipate heat through transpiration in the leaves.
Through transpiration, tree leaves can restore their thermal balance, just as humans do when they're sweating. This little miracle of nature is common to all trees and even to all plants. But in the equatorial forest, the trees are exposed to a lot of solar radiation. It's therefore vital to know the exact importance of the phenomenon of transpiration. To quantify the water pumped into the soil from the roots, Scott Zaleska, an ecologist at the University of Arizona, measures the sap composed of 99% water.
We have flying rivers taking water from one end of the Amazon basin to the other. And these rivers are supplied by hundreds of billions of individual tributaries, which are the trees we see in the forest all around us.
To measure the amount of sap that rises in the tree, Scott Zaleska uses a device consisting of two probes that are placed in the first centimeters behind the bark at the base of the trunk.
So I'm going to just place each of these two probes into the holes I just drilled. So we've installed this on 40 trees of all different sizes in this forest, so we're able to see how different trees of different species behave. And with these instruments, we were able to precisely measure the pulse of water flowing through the xylem tubes every hour, every day, every season, from year to year.
But it's not easy to quantify the respiration of the forest from the data of only a few dozen trees. To account for the variability of the situations of trees and other plants that also emit water vapor, a number of tools have been developed. Scott Zaleska fought hard to install high towers equipped with these sophisticated instruments.
Every day we get a pulse of the life of the forest. And we're able to measure not only the individual fluxes of each of those tributaries on the ground with those sap flux measurements, but we can measure the total amount, the total flow of that geyser with the special instrumentation on this tower.
This anemometer records the wind speed around the tower with a high degree of precision and in 3 dimensions.
And we can see how much water vapor is in the wind coming down, which is dry, and how much water vapor is in the wind going up, which is wet. And that difference gives us a measure of that 30 tons of water that's coming off of every hectare of forest upwind of the tower in that direction.
You know, when a large tree in the Amazon can transpire up to 1,000 liters in a single day, and this is vapor that comes into the atmosphere, and that's why I call those trees green geysers. Now imagine, in the Amazon you have up to 400 billion trees. So you have 400 billion geysers producing a flow of vapor that is larger than the Amazon River.
Tree transpiration has long been known of, but the impressive amounts of water vapor actually transpired has only recently become apparent. According to Antonio Nobre's calculations, the Amazon rainforest vaporizes the equivalent of 20 billion tons of water per day into the atmosphere. Compared to the 17 billion tons of water that the Amazon, the largest river on the continent, pours every day into the Atlantic. This gigantic transpiration is made possible by the morphological structure of the trees.
Leo, the reason the forest transpires so much water is because it's a three-dimensional structure. One tree occupies 1 square meter of ground at the base of its trunk. And if you add together the sum of all the leaves on the upper part of the tree, it's more than 150 square meters.
You mean there are more leaves than trunk?
That's right. If you compare the evaporation from this three-dimensional structure with an ocean, for example, or a lake or a river, you have 1 square meter of water evaporating into 1 square meter of air.
Does that mean that in terms of water evaporation into the air, a hectare of forest is more efficient than a hectare of ocean?
Exactly. This comparison between evaporation from a forest and that from a stretch of water isn't common knowledge. People aren't aware of it, but it gives us a view of how the forest can influence climate.
So the vertical nature of this three-dimensional structure, the verticality of the forest, is a key factor in explaining this huge mass of evaporation.
It's the key factor in the forest's ability to transpire a massive volume of water, which has a very important role in humidifying the air. And the quantity of green geysers, of trees, plays a crucial role in the regional climate.
The structure of the large trees of the Amazon forest acts as an immense surface of solar panels, which explains the phenomenal amount of transpiration of the trees. After having highlighted the prodigious capacities of the forest to contribute to the flying rivers, Antonio Nobre began to take an interest in the climatological data on the scale of the continent, and he encountered some tenacious paradoxes.
And here you have the representation of the trade winds, these low-lying winds that blow over ocean and land. They flow from both hemispheres towards the equator, but they never cross the equator, except for the big South American hydrological portal from Maranhão all the way to the French Guiana. And these trade winds cross unceremoniously the equator, penetrating the Amazon, going all the way to Argentina, and no explanation. And this, for me, became a puzzle. You have a movement of winds around the planet, and there is an exception. And that happens to be right in the Amazon.
During his research, Professor Nobre encountered another, just as disturbing paradox.
You know, traditionally, meteorology has that hot surface has low pressure, and a cold surface has high pressure. And the wind blows always from the high pressure to the low pressure. Then, when I started looking into the data of the Amazon, the flows between the Atlantic Ocean and the forest, it was precisely the reverse. The wind blows from the Atlantic, which is most of the time hotter, than the Amazon, which is most of the time cooler. How come? How could the wind blow from the low pressure into the high pressure? It's like a car going up the hill without the engine turned.
These two puzzles would keep Antonio Nobre awake at night. But his scientific quest would come up against the indifference of his colleagues.
I was for years pondering on fundamental questions connecting life and environment, especially climate. And I came across many unsolved paradoxes. And I kept knocking on the door of meteorologists, including my own family. I have 2 meteorologist brothers, asking for solutions. I cannot explain this, and they couldn't either. I could not get an answer that made sense physically.
Antonio Nobre read numerous books, articles, and theories until his curiosity finally led him to open a book written by Russian physicists who were completely unknown to him.
Maybe there is something here. I got the book and started reading, and it was frantic. I started reading like I couldn't stop, and I read the book in a go almost. And every chapter was like a discovery, some, like a fusion of finding something. Like when you open a treasure trove. They were explaining how life could fend for itself, how life could create conditions physically that would make them flourish and expand and stay and keep itself running.
After reading this book, Antonio Nobre contacted the authors, Viktor Gorchkov and Anastasia Makareva, physicists based in St. Petersburg. Their innovative theory was developed in this modest dacha, an hour from St. Petersburg. First by the remarkable physicist Gorchkov, and then in partnership with Anastasia Makareva. Viktor Gorchkov died in 2019, a few years after collaborating with Antonio Nobre.
This is where Victor worked for many years. It was here that he turned towards earth sciences and life sciences, which resulted in the biotic pump theory. The biotic pump is the result of both physics theory and life sciences. It could not have been discovered by someone who didn't have fundamental knowledge in both of these fields.
Unlike with common methods in climatology, the physicists at the St. Petersburg Nuclear Institute used only the fundamental laws of physics to solve Nobre's problems.
Professor Nobre told us about the surprising characteristics of atmospheric circulation above the Amazon rainforest and asked us to explain it with physics theory. He also told us about the massive flow of water vapor, which, through the transpiration of the rainforest and evaporation from the leaves of trees, enters the air. Green leaves enrich the air with water vapor, which is a unique substance.
As the water vapor molecules rise in the atmosphere, they encounter colder and colder temperatures, and their energy decreases. When they bump into each other, they can no longer separate. They then condense into droplets, occupy much less volume than during their gas phase, and become clouds.
The empty space created after condensation leads to a drop in the pressure of the remaining air in the condensation zone, in the atmospheric column. The vertical redistribution of air over a large area results in a pressure drop in the lower part of the atmosphere, so much so that moist air in nearby areas where the pressure is higher begins to move towards the rainforest.
The biotic pump is the mechanism that causes and controls winds and attracts wet air masses from the ocean to the land. This phenomenon is based on the condensation of the enormous flow of water vapor from the transpiration of the forest.
We came up with a theoretical estimate of the power of this process, and it happened to coincide with the observed power of atmospheric circulation. This means that the biotic pump mechanism plays a big role in the formation of atmospheric movements and might be the cause of the astonishing fact that air from the Atlantic Ocean crosses the equator into the southern hemisphere above the Amazon basin.
The discovery of the biotic pump explains why in the Amazon the winds blow in from the ocean to the forest. They thus manage to cross the equator, feeding the flying rivers. But above all, this discovery sheds light on the major climatic role played by forests on all continents.
It's not just the Amazon, but all large natural forests act as biotic pumps. It's true of the equatorial forests of Africa, the unique forests of Papua New Guinea, and the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska. And finally, the exceptional forest belt of Russia, which transports moisture from 3 oceans inland and has a decisive influence on the atmospheric circulation of Eurasia.
The biotic pump is the mechanism which has the capacity to keep the continents moist with humidity. If the biotic pump, for any reason, were to disappear tomorrow, in less than 10 years, all the water, all the fresh water in the continents would drain entirely to the oceans.
But how can the boreal forests of the Northern Hemisphere, composed mainly of conifers, ensure the functioning of the biotic pump? Especially since, for half of the year, they're plunged into near darkness, unlike the great tropical forests. In a forest reserve near Siberia, we accompany Alexei Alenikov and Gregory Poshvanov, experts in the physiology and metabolism of plants in the Arctic region.
The boreal forests have 2 kinds of tree, conifers and deciduous. Deciduous trees shed their leaves in winter, and photosynthesis is naturally suspended. Whereas with conifers, photosynthesis can continue, as long as the temperature remains above 0. When it descends to below 0, the metabolism of conifers turns to protecting trees against extremely low temperatures. Special substances called cryoprotectants build up, and these protect vegetal cells from breaking during the formation of ice crystals.
During the winter, life is almost entirely at a standstill in the boreal regions. The temperatures, very clearly below 0, make the physical state of water vapor impossible. As a result, trees cannot transpire, and the biotic pump cannot operate during the long boreal winter, and rainfall is almost 0.
But everything changes in spring. The thaw comes, the ice melts, and the forest wakes up and starts functioning again. The biotic pump resumes its job of transporting moist air to the interior of the continent. This produces rainfall, which feeds the great Siberian rivers, which, in turn, flow into the Arctic Ocean.
During the summer, when the forest is active, the performance of the boreal forest, which stretches all around the globe on either side of the Arctic Circle, is surprisingly quite similar to that of the Amazon rainforest. It turns out to be twice the size of the tropical rainforest, and it gets 20 hours of sunlight a day. Shortly after the discovery of the biotic pump, another crucial discovery was made on the Amazon rainforest by researchers who were trying to understand why the rains are so frequent. The research is being conducted in one of the most pristine places in the Amazon rainforest, under the leadership of Alessandro Araujo, a carbon cycle specialist, and scientists from the Max Planck Institute, including Stefan Wolf.
It was very difficult getting to Ato, a 6, 7, 8-hour trip.
I remember once leaving Manaus at night, and when we reached Ato, it was night again.
It's a long journey to reach this place, which is as far away from human activities as possible. A last rather tropical checkpoint on the Uatuma River before focusing on how rain forms over the forest.
One of our interests is to learn more about the formation of rain by the rainforest itself. And there is very, very small particles involved, which we call cloud condensation nuclei. And these cloud condensation nuclei are formed in the forest and above the forest by the emission of gases which meet other gases in the atmosphere, and then directly new particles are generated, and these particles are accumulating water vapor, and after a while a cloud droplet is formed.
We made it. Here's our little tower.
Yeah.
I think she's beautiful.
She's a little taller than the Eiffel Tower, I think.
4 meters taller.
Right.
To guarantee results that are as indisputable as possible, the scientific base was constructed at a distance from the tower and its hypersensitive sensors. The Ato Tower is an exceptional scientific tool, which has only one equivalent in the world, the Zotto Tower in Siberia. Sensors placed all the way up collect various aerosols. Microparticles torn from the trees by the winds, dust, bacteria, and suspended mineral pollens, which are found in the lower layer of the atmosphere. Air samples arrive through pipes in these containers, where they're analysed by a battery of devices. All the means to know as finely as possible, these aerosols have been deployed.
Great point we can do here is doing profile measurements, gradients of aerosols. That means we can see the differences in aerosol concentrations in the forest and above the forest. So we can see differences in the early morning, in the afternoon, regarding quantities, regarding size distribution of these very small particles.
The aerosols above the canopy are very varied and of nanometric size, making their identification difficult. Surprisingly, the first results show a strong presence of potassium, an element very present in fungi.
If we look a bit deeper in the emission of fungus, we see that beside those fungal spores, which have sizes of around 1 micrometer or bigger, also some potassium salt-rich aerosols are emitted. And those potassium salt-rich aerosols act as seeds for cloud condensation nuclei. And these cloud condensation nuclei are just the beginning of clouds, and these clouds are bringing the rain to this rainforest here. And so we see that up to a certain percentage, this rainforest is controlling its own precipitation.
The discovery of the role of aerosols emitted by trees in the forming of raindrops allows us to better understand how forests work. The frequent rains that occur over the forest are important. They allow the trees to emit large amounts of water vapor and thus feed the flying rivers throughout their journey over the immense Amazon. For Antonio Nobre, this discovery confirms his idea that life is organized to self-perpetuate.
What's the answer? The answer is that the trees are releasing chemicals. You know,
so cloud condensation nuclei.
Cloud condensation nuclei, which I call the fairy dust. Okay, it's a magical powder, invisible, you can't see, but it's very effective in attracting water vapor molecules and produce droplets. So now the forest is combing the water vapor that was an evil because it's trapping heat, and bring back as a rainfall, which is life-giving, okay? And at the same time, releasing the heat there high up. Why it's so important for cooling? So when the condensation happens at 4 or 5 kilometers high, it releases much closer to the space. So this heat that was harvested on the surface as the trees were transpiring is released to the space. It's a vertical mechanism of cooling. This is very important and very powerful mechanism of cooling, and it's not being taken as seriously as it should. But what the biotic pump is telling, that this whole process is interconnected, and the water vapor, for that reason, is a key player in the role of the forest towards climate change. So carbon is important, it is, but it's just a minor part. The water and energy cycle is much more important than carbon.
When I first came to the Amazon in 2000, 1999, 2000, we first met then, 22 years ago.
2 years ago.
I was all focused on carbon.
Me too, back then.
Yeah, and the question was, is the Amazon forest a carbon sink, even today? How big is the sink? Will the sink be lost? And will it become a source? All carbon, 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 carbon. The thing that we really neglected, I think, we neglected the important role of the water cycle. And now, in the last few years, the connection to the water cycle seems to loom much larger in my mind. And the fact that they're coupled together.
And we have all the tools, conceptually, computationally, and even theoretically, to compute these contributions.
As scientists share their views on the state of their knowledge, the greatest concerns weigh on forests, and in particular the Amazon rainforest. More than 100,000 fires are recorded every year, a worrying number that a small department of the INPE called Queimadas, led by Alberto Seltzer, count every day thanks to satellites.
We work with about 10 satellites and we process something like 200 different images per day. And then everything is done inside computers. We have methods that will find where the vegetation is burning. We'll calculate that location quite precisely.
After several years of existence, the Queimadas department now has edifying data on fires in the Amazon.
There are many important things to look at this map. Here we see fires along the Amazon River. People live close to the river and they also tend to burn. For instance, we see a large concentration of fires along this line. Why? Because there is a road going from Cuiabá to Santarém. Once you open a road, people start moving in, they start using fire, and the satellites detect the fire. The same thing here with the Trans-Amazon road. We can see fires concentrated along that road.
There's no doubt about it. Due to the prevailing humidity, the Amazon forest doesn't burn on its own, and yet burn it does.
The equation is very simple. People equals fire, nothing else. We estimate that about 20% of the natural forest was already removed. Beyond the 20%, we also must consider the partial degradation of the forest, where you have trees that are cut and fires that spread inside the forest. If you take this also into account, the damage into the forest is not 20%, it's probably something like 40 or 50%.
A sword of Damocles hangs over the great virgin forests that guarantee the stability of the climate, and the consequences of their disappearance have been well studied. Two scenarios are proposed. According to meteorologists, this would lead to a savannization where life would still be possible. But to proponents of the biotic pump, the future looks much grimmer.
In 2006, when we launched the Flying Rivers project, the launching phrase for this project was, if deforestation keeps going, very soon we will have São Paulo becoming a desert. And this was met with skepticism by climatologists, and many people thought it was overstatement. This advanced phenomena of deforestation cannot be better illustrated than looking to what is happening to Iguazu Falls drying up right now. Usually the Iguazu River has 1,700 cubic meters per second of runoff. Today, the runoff of the river is between 300 and 400. It's 1/5 of the usual. Of course, we are in the dry season, and usually in the dry season it goes down, but not as much as you were seeing today. So if you look there, in average, even in the dry season, you have that wall covered with water. And today you can see there's a trickle of water coming down.
For Antonio Nobre, the sad spectacle he has before his eyes is the confirmation of what he anticipated more than 15 years ago.
We have measurements showing that the flow of water from the Amazon in the air is going down. So the flying rivers are getting weaker and weaker. And the danger is that the diminishing arrival of water will eventually break this wonderful connection through the flying rivers of the Amazon service to the climate and this enormous area in South America, which is the largest, most productive area in the continent.
Could massive reforestation remedy this situation?
The biotic pump theory says basically that pristine forests cannot be easily substituted, especially by monoculture, especially by agriculture, especially even for native forests, which will take a long time to recover the capacity, because it's like tens of years or even hundreds of years to be fully functional. So we have this system that took millions and millions of years to evolve. It's incredibly competent in providing this fantastic control and environmental service, and we should not lose it.
Wanting to unravel the mysteries of flying rivers, scientists have discovered the sophisticated role of trees in the hydrological cycle, the fundamental mechanism of the biotic pump, and above all, the essential action of forests in regulating the climate and limiting global warming. Forests all over the world need to be protected more than ever.
If we lose the being, the forest, the spirit, then we lose rainfall. And if we lose rainfall, we have nothing to drink, nothing to eat. Across the native culture, you find this wisdom. And we, the evolving society, so-called civilized society, should learn with the natives. You know, it's easy, actually. Leave the forest alone.